All right, welcome everyone. Welcome atheists, agnostics, skeptics, free thinkers. You are all welcome here. And we call ourselves Seattle Atheist Church because you will never hear anything supernatural talked about from the podium. So please come on up.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Mickey Phoenix. I'm a software engineer and an ex-fundamentalist Christian, passing along the way through a great deal of liberal Christianity. I'm here today to talk about Stanley Milgram's shock experiments. Stanley Milgram was a professor at Yale in the 1960s. Many people, not just Stanley Milgram, at the time were somewhat troubled by these still painfully recent events of the Second World War. In particular, in 1961, a man named Adolf Eichmann went on trial in Jerusalem. Adolf Eichmann was the commandant of a death camp in Germany, responsible for the murder of hundreds of thousands of Jews, Romani people, homosexuals, and other undesirables, according to the Nazi regime. And there's a really good book, which I'm going to recommend to all of you, written by a woman named Hannah Arendt, A-R-E-N-D-T, called Eichmann in Jerusalem, about Eichmann's trials for war crimes and crimes against humanity. Hannah Arendt made herself very unpopular with this book because its basic thesis was that Adolf Eichmann wasn't a monster. See, the problem when you look at something like Nazi Germany or a person like Adolf Eichmann is that Nazi Germany wasn't one guy named Adolf Hitler and 11 million people dead. Nazi Germany was a guy named Adolf Hitler and a guy named Eichmann, and a million fairly anonymous German soldiers in black shirts and pants, each one killing 5 or 10 or 20 or 100 or 1,000 Jews or homosexuals. And you have to ask yourself, where did the Germans find a million sociopathic murderous monsters? I mean, Germany's population isn't that big. Sociopathy rates, they run something like 0.5% to 1% in a lot of societies. So where do you get the people who shove people into the cattle cars on the trains? Who runs the crematoria? This was the question that Professor Stanley Milgram wanted to address. So he came up with an experimental design to find out which people are willing to follow orders, and why they're willing to follow orders when those orders have to conflict with their own conscience. If I said to you, punch that person behind you, you'd look at me like I was crazy. What do you mean punch that person behind you? Punch them. You have to punch them, right? Well, what if I were wearing a suit instead of a t-shirt with a vaguely anti-religious slogan on it? What if I were wearing a suit and standing in the front of a really big fancy building? What if my title were El Presidente? Or, well, in the case of, us, President. What happens when an authority says, punch that person behind you, and you know they've done nothing wrong? What do you do? So this is the shape of the Milgram experiment. It involves an experimenter who is obviously, they're wearing the white lab coat, they're in a Yale psychology research building in a lab with chrome and steel and looking all professional, all of the markings and trappings of legitimately constituted authority. And it involves a subject. And it involves a confederate. You guys know what a confederate is? It's someone who's playing along with the experimenter. They're actually a secret other experimenter, okay? And the subject comes in to the lab, they've been told they're doing an experiment on learning, specifically on negative reinforcement and learning. And the experimenter says, so we have this machine here. It gives electric shocks. Okay? One of you is going to be the teacher, one of you is going to be the learner. The teacher is going to sit here at the machine and read pairs of words, and then quiz the learner on those pairs of words. And you're going to, you write down how many they get right, how many they get wrong, right? Standard learning experiment with a twist. If they give a wrong answer, you push this button and it gives them a shock. Here, grab these wires and hand the wires to the actual subject of the experiment, and they give him or her a little shock. It's pretty painful, like a shock. And every time they get a wrong answer, you move the voltage up, 15 volts. And everybody start getting a little creeped out here? Okay? Now, the other view is going to be the learner. You're going to be sitting in this chair with your hands strapped down to these electrodes, and you're going to be listening to the words, and every time you get the words right, everything's fine. If you get the words wrong, we'll give you a shock. We're going to see whether shocking people makes them learn better or worse or faster or slower. Everyone understand this? Yeah, okay, makes sense. So the experimenter holds out two pieces of paper face down. Each of you take a piece of paper. Here you are, you're the subject of the experiment. You reach out, you take a piece of paper, and the other subject next to you takes a piece of paper. And you look at yours and it says, teacher. And they're like, I guess I'm the learner. Both pieces of paper say teacher, of course. But you never see the other guy's piece of paper. It's called a forced choice, and it's a very effective way of making people think that they've actually taken a random choice. But really, the actual subject always ends up as the teacher. The teacher remember, they felt the electric shock, they know how uncomfortable it is. They sit down in front of this console of switches with this list of words and this list of questions to quiz the other person with. And the experimenter takes the other person into another room and they strap down their hands to the electrodes, right? There's no actual electricity hooked up to the wires. They're just sitting in the chair waiting. And they hook up a little tape recorder to the machine. And the tape recorder, you push the 15-volt shock and it goes, You push the 30-volt shock, it goes, oh! Push the 45-volt shock, the tape recorder goes, ow! Push the 60-volt shock, it goes, around 130 volts, the tape recorder goes, I have a heart condition, stop! Around 180 volts, the person stops making noise. It's labeled up to 360 volts, and then XXX is the final setting. All right? The experimenter says, start the experiment. And you, the subject of the experiment, who is in this case in the teacher role every time because of that little forced choice with pieces of paper, you start reading words. And the learner starts answering the questions, and they get it wrong. And like a good little participant in a psychology experiment, you push the button, and you hear, and you read some more words, and they get some more wrong, and you flip it up to 30, and you push the button, you hear, kind of disturbing. You might imagine, and certainly if you were the review board, because this is not the Dark Ages. Any experiment design like this gets reviewed by an ethics review board before it's approved, right? This wasn't Milgram going, I think I'll just go off and do this crazy experiment of terrorizing people for fun. No, he actually wrote up the whole experimental design and he ran it past the Yale University Ethics Review Board. And they looked at it and said, like, this is a really heavy experiment. But you know what? We're going to debrief the subjects afterwards. We're going to tell them, hey, no real humans were actually shocked in the making of this experiment. And the only people who are actually going to go all the way up to the XXX setting and think they killed someone are the sociopathic 0.5% of the population who already won't care. So we're not going to do any major psychological harm to people. We're not going to have people walking out thinking they're potential murderers. Because the only people who are ever going to go that high are the people who already don't have empathy. They don't have the ability to feel bad about hurting people, right? So they approved the experiment. They started getting people from the Yale community to come into this nice official building where they met along with their other supposed experimental subject, who's actually the Confederate, by this guy in a lab coat, guy absolutely because, authority figures and all. And you know, there's this whole scripted session. They start sitting people down and having them flip switches. And they get what is probably the most disturbing result in modern psychology. Anyone want to take a guess at what percentage of subjects ended up going all the way to the XXX setting, past I have a heart condition and please stop and let me go, and silence?
30.
30? Wow, that's a big number.
15.
15.
5.
5.
80.
65%. 2/3 of male subjects will kill on command. 2/3 of the people in this room will kill on command. Look to your left, look to your right. If it's not them, it's you. Sounds funny, but this is what killed 11 million people during World War II. This is what killed the millions of people who died under Pol Pot. This is what killed the 40 million people Stalin killed. It's not monsters. It's humans. It's us. 65% of the subjects will kill on command. Well, this was a pretty horrifying outcome for poor Professor Milgram. This was not what he had expected to find. So he started changing the experimental conditions. Firstly, he was trying to look for something that would tell which people push the button and which ones refuse. Well, it turns out that you can make some changes. If you take off the white lab coat, a lot fewer people kill. If you take off the white lab coat, suddenly it's not a Yale University professor running a psychology experiment. Suddenly it's just some guy saying, hey, I want to give shocks to this person, it'll be fun. A lot more people refuse. But they had a really hard time finding differences in the individuals, in the subjects of the experiment. I mean, surely religious people will be less likely to murder on command. No. Well, surely atheists will be less likely to murder on command. No. Religion, philosophy, made no difference at all. Atheism, freethinkers, just as 65%. What about smart people? How many people in this room are smart? Raise your hand if you're smart. Come on, get those hands up. I know better. Okay. Smart people? No. Intelligence. Intelligence didn't matter. 65% of smart people will kill on command. 65% of dumb people will kill on command. 65% of people will kill on command. What about rich people? Surely rich people are cold and uncaring bastards, or poor people are desperate and will follow authority. Doesn't matter how rich you are. Socioeconomic status makes no difference, 65%. How about gender? How about the tender mercies of the feminine heart?
Don't let them give it to the women.
Yeah. First difference. First difference. Gender makes a difference. 65% of men will kill on command. What percentage of women will kill on command?
If it's a man giving the command.
It's a man giving the command. What percentage of women will kill on command? Give me some guesses.
15.
15? What do you think? 20?
Between 60 and 70.
60% of women. It's slightly less. Which says interesting things, by the way, because there are two different forces at play there. Women are taught to be obedient to male authority in our culture, and women are taught to be compassionate and not hurt people in our culture. Looks like the balance of those is not much of a difference, actually. 60% of women, like 65% of men, will kill on command. That is such a small difference, it barely is worth noting, except that they couldn't find anything that made a bigger difference. People across the board. And this has been replicated since in multiple cultures. The percentages differ, but the pattern is the same. People kill on command. So they decided to try another variation. And this one, I actually debated whether to talk about this because there are children present. And this is, if anything, more disturbing. But it's also important enough to know. They wanted to find out whether empathy, whether the amount of whether the thing that made people able to kill on command was that the other person was off in a room somewhere and they were just pushing buttons, or whether they could increase the empathic identification, how much sympathy the subject of the experiment, the teacher, felt with the learner. So they tried things like putting the learner in the same room. Now, of course, you had to have an actor then who would twitch convincingly, but that's not too hard to do. But put the actor in the same room. Compliance went down a little. When you can see the person you're hurting, you hurt them less. The closest proximity, because if your physical proximity matters, if you're doing it to someone right there, it matters, and agency, if you're just pushing a button is easy. So in the closest, highest empathy version, they had the learner, who again is the confederate who's working with the experiment. No one's actually getting shocked in these experiments at all, no one's actually getting hurt, except the subject. But the learner, they had an insulated handle strapped onto their hand. And the subject of the experiment had to grab the handle and push their hand down on a shock plate to administer the shock. Direct, immediate, physical, right by their side, torturing someone, they thought. Guesses on percentage of compliance?
10.
That one got it under 50.
35% of men and 30% of women will kill someone sitting right next to them with their bare hands by a slow, torturous death because they're told to. It doesn't even take, if you don't do this, I'll shoot you. The experimenter, the person playing the role of the experimenter, had a very limited set of things they were allowed to say. They couldn't say, if you leave this experiment, we'll shoot you. And you can, if you're Nazi Germany, you can say, if you set those Jews free, we'll shoot you. The experimenter was allowed to say, the experiment requires that you continue. That was the lowest level prompt, was the experiment requires you continue. There were a couple others I don't remember, and the highest level prompt was, you have no choice, you must go on. And that's the only thing they were allowed to do to make the subject stay. You have no choice, you must go on. And 30% of people, 33% averaging men and women, will torture someone to death with their own hands because they're told to by someone in a white lab coat. Or a black shirt with little lightning bolts on the shoulder. Or a blue shirt with a police badge on it. That's the takeaway of Milgram shock experiments. Humans are obedient to authority over their own conscience. Humans will torture and kill on command. There's a tiny spot of light at the end of the tunnel on this one. There is a difference between people who do and don't comply. It's just not an easily measured demographic difference. It's the kind of family they were raised in. If you are raised, there are three basic kinds of family dynamic for raising children. There's authoritarian. I told you to do your homework! There's authoritative. I'm sorry, since you haven't done your homework yet, you can't go out and play with your friends. You have to stay inside until your homework's done. We made that agreement. And there's permissive. Oh, well, I don't want you to not have fun with your friends, so I guess you can do the homework tomorrow morning before school. Okay. I've exaggerated those a little bit, but only a little bit. If you've ever been around an authoritarian family, they really do bellow and shout and terrorize their children like that, or hit them or spank them or whatever. Well, it turns out that if you raise your children to obey you under threat of terror, fear, and pain, they'll obey anyone under threat of terror, fear, and pain. If your kid decides it's really fun to draw on crayon on your nice newly painted wall, and you turn her over your knee and you spank her, when some police officer says, shoot that person, they'll shoot that person. Or put down that camera. Put down that camera. And they put down the camera, and there's no record of them beating someone up and killing them. If you teach your children good boundaries and respect for each other, if you teach them that it's safe to disagree with you, they'll disagree with authority. Children of authoritative families are much, much less likely to comply in the Milgram shock experiment. Children of authoritarian families are much, much more likely to comply, because what they learned as the very impressionable, moldable things that we all are as children, what they learned is if you resist authority, you get tortured. One thing I've learned as a parent is that, if someone walked up to me and punched me in the face really hard, I would be hurt and scared and angry. If I look at my kid and say, I am so disappointed in you, they are more hurt and scared and angry than if I punched an adult in the face. Adults don't realize, parents, a lot of parents don't realize, I didn't realize this for decades. My oldest daughter is 20 and I only figured this out like 3 years ago. So she had 17 years of a dad who didn't realize exactly how hard every word hits. But if you say to your kid, how could you do that? That leaves scars. And it's the kind of scars that when someone says, you have no choice, you must go on, push the button, they push the button. I can't think of anything more important than raising children who are willing to stand up and say, no, this is wrong. There's another variation of the experiment they did, where they had multiple teams of teacher and learner in the same room. And one of the teachers was also a Confederate and stood up and walked out partway through. Whether or not anyone else stood up and walked out at the same time, having had the example that resistance was possible, greatly decreased compliance across the board. Having seen someone stand up and say, no, this is wrong, gave everyone else permission to act according to their conscience. It's like herd immunity in vaccinations. It's not just your kid's life you're saving with a vaccine, it's all the other people who now won't get it, even if they couldn't be vaccinated, because there are fewer unvaccinated people around. If you vaccinate your children against blind obedience to authority, if your children, or if you are the one who stands up and says, no, this is wrong, no, I won't put my camera down, officer, why are you punching that black man in the back of the head while he's lying on the ground? Other people will see that, and it will enable them to resist immoral authority. Let's move our chairs into a circle and discuss Stanley Milgram and the shock experiments.